Brian Thomas stood frozen as Zara, his wife's Zarantine friend, loudly demanded to see what was between his legs. The alien's intoxicated outburst shattered the polite atmosphere of the social gathering at their home on New Harmony, the interspecies colony world. Janice, Brian's Zarantine wife, flushed a deep shade of purple, her embarrassment visible even through her iridescent scales. The other female Zarantines in attendance fell silent, their compound eyes fixed on Brian with a mixture of shock and unmistakable curiosity. As the only human Zarantine married couple on New Harmony, Brian and Janice were accustomed to being the center of attention. Their union symbolized the delicate alliance between humans and Zarantines on this fledgling colony. But this situation threatened to upset years of careful diplomacy. Brian's mind raced. He'd faced challenging scenarios as a human living among aliens, but nothing quite like this. The fermented nectar, a potent Zarantine beverage, had clearly lowered Zara's inhibitions. Her outburst opened a floodgate of questions from the other guests who had never seen a human male unclothed. "Is it true humans have external reproductive organs?" one Zarantine asked, her antennae twitching with interest. "Do you lay eggs like us?" another chimed in, leaning forward on her multiple legs. Brian tried to deflect, his face burning. "I don't think this is appropriate dinner conversation," he said, looking to Janice for support. Janice stepped in, her translator working overtime as she tried to explain human concepts of privacy to her friends. "In human culture, displaying one's genitals is considered intimate and personal," she said, her voice strained. But the aliens persisted, citing cultural differences and scientific curiosity. One argued, "But we're all friends here. Surely among friends, such barriers can be lowered for the sake of understanding?" Brian felt trapped. He knew the wrong move could jeopardize not just his marriage, but the entire human Zarantine alliance. News of this unusual party was already spreading through the colony's communication networks, reaching the human governor's office. Janice sensed her husband's discomfort. She placed a clawed hand on his arm, her touch gentle despite her alien physiology. "Perhaps this could be an opportunity for greater interspecies understanding," she suggested softly, her compound eyes meeting his human ones. The party atmosphere grew tenser with each passing moment. Brian realized his decision could impact far more than just this gathering. As a symbol of human Zarantine cooperation, any scandal involving him and Janice could have far-reaching consequences for the colony's future. In the distance, Brian heard the faint hum of approaching vehicles. Colony officials, no doubt, preparing to intervene if necessary. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he stood there, the center of attention in a room full of expectant aliens. His personal comfort warred with the potential benefits to human-alien relations. Could exposing himself really bridge the gap between their species, or would it only lead to more misunderstandings? As the Zarantine guests awaited his response with bated breath, Brian Thomas found himself at a crossroads. His next move would shape not just this evening, but potentially the future of human-alien interactions on New Harmony. The fate of interspecies diplomacy hung in the balance, all because of one drunken alien's curiosity about what lay beneath his clothes. Brian took a deep breath, his mind racing to find a solution that would satisfy the alien's curiosity without compromising his dignity or the delicate diplomatic balance. Suddenly, an idea struck him. "I have a compromise," he announced, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "While I'm not comfortable exposing myself, I can show you a detailed holographic representation of human male anatomy." A collective murmur of interest rippled through the Zarantine guests. Janice visibly relaxed, her scales shifting from deep purple to a more neutral hue. "Give me a moment," Brian said, excusing himself from the gathering. He hurried to their home office, rummaging through drawers until he found the medical hologram device they kept for emergencies. As he returned to the living area, he could hear the excited chittering of the Zarantines. Brian activated the device, and a blue-tinted three-dimensional image of a human male's body materialized in the center of the room. The hologram slowly rotated, offering a 360-degree view of human anatomy. The Zarantines crowded around, their compound eyes wide with fascination. Some leaned in close, antennae twitching as they examined the hologram's details. "Fascinating," exclaimed one Zarantine, her multiple legs skittering with excitement. The placement of organs is so different from ours. Another alien pointed at the hologram's lower half. Is that the external reproductive organ you mentioned, Janice? Janice, seeing an opportunity to steer the conversation in a more educational direction, stepped forward. Yes, that's correct. In humans, male genitalia are external, unlike our internal reproductive systems. As Janice began explaining human biology to her friends, Brian noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The initial tension and awkwardness gave way to genuine curiosity and scientific interest. Even Zara, who had started this whole situation with her drunken outburst, was now listening intently, her earlier belligerence replaced by rapt attention. Just as Brian started to relax, the sound of a vehicle pulling up outside caught his attention. Moments later, the front door swung open, revealing a stern-faced human man in his 50s, followed by a middle-aged woman in a lab coat. "Governor Steele," Brian said, recognizing the colony's leader. "We weren't expecting you." Governor Marcus Steele's eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene, the hologram, the clustered Zarantines, and Brian and Janice at the center of it all. His expression was a mixture of concern and barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Thomas," he addressed them formally, "I received some concerning reports about the nature of this gathering. I hope you understand why I felt compelled to investigate personally." Before Brian could respond, Zara stumbled forward, her movement still unsteady from the fermented nectar. "Governor," she slurred, her translator struggling to keep up with her excited chirps. "You should see this. Humans are so fascinating. Did you know they have their reproductive organs on the outside? It's like they're wearing them." Governor Steele's face reddened, while the woman beside him, who Brian now recognized as Dr. Lyra, the colony's lead xenobiologist, struggled to maintain her professional composure. "I think we need to have a word in private, Mr. Thomas," the governor said, his voice low and controlled. As Brian followed Governor Steele to a corner of the room, he could hear Dr. Lyra engaging with the Zarantines, her scientific curiosity piqued by the impromptu anatomy lesson. "Mr. Thomas," Governor Steele began, his tone serious, "I hope you realize the gravity of this situation. News of this incident has already spread through both human and Zarantine communities. The potential for misunderstanding and diplomatic tension is significant." Brian nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "Governor, I assure you, this wasn't planned. We were trying to handle a delicate situation in the best way possible." As they continued their hushed conversation, Dr. Lyra approached, her eyes bright with an idea. "Governor, Mr. Thomas, if I may interject, I believe we have an opportunity here." Both men turned to her, curious. "What we're seeing is a genuine desire for knowledge on both sides," Dr. Lyra explained. "Why not channel this into something productive? I propose we establish a formal cultural exchange program. Educational seminars where both species can learn about each other's biology, culture, and social norms in a controlled, respectful environment." Governor Steele's brow furrowed as he considered the proposal. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "It could work. If handled correctly, this could turn a potential diplomatic nightmare into a step forward for interspecies relations." As the evening wound down and the Zarantine guests began to leave, Brian and Janice found themselves exhausted but relieved. They carefully helped the still tipsy Zara into a transport, ensuring she'd get home safely. Once alone, Brian and Janice settled onto their custom-made couch, designed to accommodate both human and Zarantine physiology. For a moment, they sat in silence, processing the evening's events. "Well," Janice finally said, her voice tinged with both amusement and exasperation, "that wasn't quite the dinner party we had planned." Brian chuckled, the tension of the evening finally breaking. "No, it certainly wasn't. But maybe some good will come of it." They discussed the proposed cultural exchange program, recognizing the unique role they could play as an interspecies couple. Their conversation drifted to the challenges they'd faced and overcome, and the unexpected position they now found themselves in as unofficial ambassadors for human-Zarantine relations. As they prepared for bed, Brian and Janice agreed to participate in Dr. Lyra's program. They knew it would mean opening up more of their personal lives to public scrutiny, but they also saw the potential for fostering greater understanding between their species. Lying in their specially designed bed, Brian stared at the ceiling, his mind still processing the events of the night. Beside him, Janus curled into her sleeping position, her exoskeleton glistening softly in the dim light. "Janus," Brian whispered, not sure if she was still awake. "Yes," she responded, her voice a soft chirp. "Do you think we're ready for this? To be at the forefront of improving human-Zarantine relations?" Janus extended one of her limbs, gently touching Brian's arm. "Ready or not, my love, it seems we're already there. But we'll face it together, just as we've faced everything else." As sleep began to overtake them, Brian's last thoughts were of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Their life on New Harmony was about to become even more interesting, and he couldn't help but wonder what surprises the future held for them, and for the delicate balance of interspecies relations on their adopted world. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, Brian and Janus stirred from their slumber. The events of the previous night still caused great concern on their minds, but a new day brought new challenges and opportunities. "Today's the day," Brian said, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Are you ready for this?" Janus extended her limbs in a stretch, her exoskeleton shifting colors as she fully awoke. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice translator conveying a similar mix of emotions. They made their way to the colony's community center, where Dr. Lyra had set up the first cultural exchange seminar. As they approached, Brian noticed a crowd gathering outside, a mix of humans and Zarantines, their differences in size and shape creating a striking visual contrast. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Humans and Zarantines mingled awkwardly, stealing curious glances at each other. Dr. Lyra bustled about, making last-minute preparations. "Brian, Janus," she called out, waving them over. "I'm so glad you're here. We're about to begin." As they took their places on the stage, Brian felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach. He looked out at the sea of faces, human and alien alike, and took a deep breath. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "I'm Brian Thomas, and this is my wife, Janus. We're here today to share our experiences as an interspecies couple." As Brian spoke, he could see the initial tension in the audience begin to dissipate. Humans leaned forward, intrigued by the alien woman beside him. Zarantines tilted their heads, their antennae twitching with interest as they listened to the human male. Janus took over, her translator conveying her words clearly. "Our journey hasn't always been easy," she said, her compound eyes scanning the crowd. "But it's been incredibly rewarding. We've learned so much about each other's cultures, biologies, and ways of thinking." As they delved deeper into their experiences, sharing anecdotes and insights, Brian noticed a commotion at the back of the room. A group of burly men had entered, led by a tall, broad-shouldered figure he recognized as Jack Hawkins, one of the colony's miners. Jack's face was contorted with anger as he shouted, "You're a disgrace, Thomas, sleeping with the enemy." The crowd gasped, turning to look at the disruption. Brian felt his heart rate spike, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Sir, this is a peaceful seminar," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you have concerns, we'd be happy to discuss them after—" His words were cut short as something small and hard whizzed past his head, narrowly missing him. The object clattered to the floor behind him, a small chunk of mineral ore. Security personnel rushed in, quickly surrounding Jack and his followers. As they were escorted out, Jack continued to shout obscenities, his face red with rage. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Brian looked at Janus, saw the concern in her alien features, and made a decision. "We're going to continue," he announced, his voice stronger now. "What just happened only reinforces why this cultural exchange is so important." As he resumed speaking, a young Zarantine female approached the stage. Her exoskeleton was a vibrant shade of blue, indicating her youth. "Excuse me," she said, her translator conveying a polite tone. "I'm Lyra, a xenobiologist. Perhaps I could assist in explaining some of the biological differences between our species." Brian nodded, grateful for the opportunity to steer the seminar back on track. As Lyra began her explanation, using holographic displays to illustrate her points, the audience's focus shifted. Humans and Zarantines alike leaned in, fascinated by the detailed comparisons. As the seminar progressed, Brian noticed Governor Steele enter the room, his face grave. The governor beckoned him over discreetly. "Brian," Steele said in a low voice, "we've received intelligence that a group of human supremacists, inspired by Jack's outburst, is planning to sabotage the program. We're working on containing the threat, but I need you and Janice to keep the seminar going. We can't let them see that they've rattled us." Brian nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He returned to the stage, continuing the seminar with new hope. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The initial awkwardness gave way to genuine curiosity and engagement. Humans and Zarantines began to mingle more freely, asking questions and sharing stories. As the seminar drew to a close, Brian noticed a familiar figure near the refreshment table. Zara, the Zarantine who had sparked the initial controversy at their dinner party, was engaged in an animated conversation with a group of human males. Concerned about potential misunderstandings, Brian made his way over to them. As he got closer, he could hear Zara's enthusiastic chirps being translated. "And then, if the male accepts, he presents the female with a bouquet of bioluminescent fungi," Zara was saying. "It's quite romantic, really." The human men looked both fascinated and slightly confused. One of them, a young man with a shock of red hair, was nodding vigorously. "So if I wanted to court a Zarantine female, I should gather glowing mushrooms?" he asked earnestly. Brian couldn't help but chuckle as he approached. "I think there might be a few more cultural nuances to consider before you start your interspecies dating journey," he said gently. As the day came to an end, Brian and Janice found themselves exhausted but proud. They had faced challenges, but the seminar had been a success overall. As they prepared to leave, Brian overheard a conversation between two Zarantine officials. "Perhaps we should consider arranging more human Zarantine marriages," one was saying. "It could strengthen our diplomatic ties." Brian and Janice exchanged a look, both realizing the implications of such a suggestion. Their relationship, once a curiosity, was now being viewed as a potential model for interspecies diplomacy. As they made their way home, Brian's mind raced with the events of the day and the challenges that lay ahead. The threat of human supremacists loomed large, as did the weight of their newfound role as unofficial ambassadors. "Janice," he said as they entered their home, "I think our lives are about to get a lot more complicated." Janice's exoskeleton shimmered with a pattern that Brian had come to recognize as her expression of wry amusement. "My dear," she replied, "I believe they already have." "My dear," Janice replied, "I believe they already have." Her exoskeleton shimmered with a pattern that Brian recognized as her expression of wry amusement. Before Brian could respond, his communicator buzzed urgently. Governor Steele's face appeared on the small holographic display. "Brian, Janice," the governor's voice was tense. "I need you both in my office immediately. We have a situation." Exchanging worried glances, Brian and Janice hurried to the colony's administrative center. As they entered Governor Steele's office, they found themselves in the midst of a gathering that radiated nervous energy. The governor sat behind his desk, his usually composed features etched with concern. To his right stood a man Brian had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a cybernetic eye that gleamed in the office's soft light. "Brian, Janice," Governor Steele began. "This is Commander Victor Orlov, head of colony security." The commander nodded curtly, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on them. "I'll cut to the chase," Orlov said, his voice gruff. "We've uncovered evidence of an underground network planning to disrupt the cultural exchange program. They're targeting you two specifically." Brian felt Janice stiffen beside him. He reached out, instinctively placing a reassuring hand on her exoskeleton. "How serious is the threat?" Brian asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Orlov's human eye narrowed. "Serious enough. We've intercepted communications suggesting they're planning more than just protests. We're talking potential violence." As the commander elaborated on the security measures being implemented, a priority transmission alert flashed on the governor's desk. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the stern face of a woman in a crisp military uniform. "Governor Steele," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. I'm Admiral Helena Campbell, newly appointed overseer of interspecies relations for the Human Galactic Alliance. The Admiral's gaze swept over the room, lingering on Brian and Janus. The situation on New Harmony has caught the attention of high-ranking officials back on Earth. We see potential here. Potential for a model of human-alien relations that could be applied across the galaxy. Brian felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. To that end, Admiral Campbell continued, I'm ordering an expansion of the cultural exchange program, and as part of this expansion, we have a special assignment for you, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. Janus's antenna twitched nervously as the Admiral outlined their assignment: participation in a Zarantine bonding ritual to be broadcast live across interstellar channels. Admiral, Brian interjected, his voice strained, with all due respect, what you're asking, it's intensely personal. To have our private life broadcast across the galaxy? This isn't a request, Mr. Thomas. Admiral Campbell cut him off. It's an order. The future of human-alien relations could hinge on this. As the transmission ended, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Brian turned to Janus, seeing the conflict in her compound eyes. Janus, he said softly, we don't have to do this if you're not comfortable. Her exoskeleton rippled with patterns of uncertainty. It is not an easy decision, she said. The ritual is sacred to my people, but if it could help foster understanding. Over the next few days, as preparations for the ritual began, the colony buzzed with tension. Brian and Janus found themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't control. Walking through the colony's main square, they were confronted by the stark division their relationship had caused. On one side, supporters cheered and waved signs promoting interspecies unity. On the other, angry protesters, led by Jack Hawkins, shouted epithets and warnings of species corruption. Commander Orlov's security forces were everywhere, their presence a constant reminder of the underlying threat. Checkpoints had sprung up overnight, and armored vehicles patrolled the streets. As the day of the ritual drew closer, the pressure began to take its toll on Brian and Janus. They found themselves arguing more frequently, their words sharp with stress and fear. One evening, as they stood in their home garden, their voices raised in frustration, neither noticed the small drone hovering just beyond their fence. You don't understand what this means for my people, Janus chittered, her translator struggling to keep up with her agitated speech. This ritual is not meant for public consumption. And you think I want to bare our private life to the entire galaxy? Brian shot back. We're being used as pawns in some political game. As their argument reached its peak, the drone silently retreated, carrying with it footage that would soon spread across the colony's networks. The morning of the ritual dawned tense and quiet. As Brian and Janus donned their ceremonial attire, a blend of human formal wear and Zarantine ritual markings, they heard a commotion outside. Peering out their window, they saw a massive crowd gathering. Supporters and protesters mingled uneasily, held apart by lines of Orlov's security forces. Brian turned to Janus, seeing his own apprehension mirrored in her alien features. He reached out, gently touching her exoskeleton. Whatever happens out there, he said softly, we face it together. Janus's antenna brushed against his hand, a gesture of affection that transcended species. Together, she agreed. As they prepared to step out into the chaos that awaited them, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this day would change everything, not just for them, but for the future of human-Zarantine relations across the galaxy. Galaxy. As they stepped out of their home, the magnitude of what lay ahead struck Brian with full force. The streets of New Harmony were a sea of chaos. Supporters and protesters alike surged towards the central plaza, their voices a cacophony of cheers and jeers. Commander Orlov's security forces formed a human barrier, their armored uniforms glinting in the morning light. Brian felt Janus's exoskeleton tremble slightly against his arm. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, marveling at how natural the gesture felt despite their physical differences. Ready? He asked, his voice barely audible above the crowd's roar. Janus's antennae twitched in what Brian had come to recognize as her expression of grit. As ready as I'll ever be, her translator conveyed. Commander Orlov himself approached them, his cybernetic eye whirring as it scanned the surroundings. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas will escort you to the plaza. Stay close." As they moved through the throng, Brian caught snippets of conversation from both sides. Some humans shouted encouragement, while others hurled insults. The Zarantines' reactions were equally divided, their chirps and clicks translated into a mix of support and disgust. The central plaza, usually a hub of everyday colony life, had been transformed. Human and Zarantine symbols intertwined in elaborate decorations, creating a visual representation of the union they were about to celebrate. At the center stood a raised platform, adorned with bioluminescent Zarantine fungi and earth flowers in an otherworldly bouquet. As they ascended the steps to the platform, Brian's eyes were drawn to a holographic projector nearby. It flickered to life, revealing the stern visage of Admiral Helena Campbell. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas," the Admiral's voice boomed across the plaza, silencing the crowd momentarily. "The eyes of two species are upon you. Make us proud." Brian nodded, swallowing hard. He turned to Janus, seeing his own mix of nervousness and perseverance reflected in her compound eyes. The ritual began with Janus taking center stage. Her exoskeleton shimmered, reflecting the sunlight in mesmerizing patterns as she began the traditional Zarantine dance. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, her limbs creating intricate shapes that told a story Brian could only begin to comprehend. Taking a deep breath, Brian stepped forward for his part. They had practiced for days, but as he attempted to mirror Janus's alien grace, he felt clumsy and out of place. His foot caught on the edge of his ceremonial robe, and he stumbled, nearly falling. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Brian's face burned with embarrassment, but as he regained his balance, he heard something unexpected. Chirps and clicks rose from the Zarantine section of the audience, their translators conveying appreciation and even endearment. "They're impressed by your effort," Janus whispered as they moved into the next phase of the ritual. "In our culture, vulnerability in pursuit of understanding is highly respected." As they prepared for the exchange of genetic material, a commotion erupted at the edge of the plaza. Brian's heart sank as he recognized Jack Hawkins's voice rising above the din. "Stop this abomination!" Jack shouted, pushing through the security cordon with a group of followers. From the opposite side, a group of Zarantines led by an elderly female surged forward, their intent clear in their aggressive postures. Commander Orlov barked orders into his communicator, his security team moving to intercept the intruders. But Jack, eyes wild with hatred, broke through. He scrambled onto the platform, brandishing a jagged piece of metal. "Traitor!" Jack spat, lunging at Brian. Time seemed to slow. Brian saw the makeshift blade arcing towards him, saw Janus in Jack's path. Without thinking, he shoved Janus aside, feeling the sting of the blade as it grazed his arm. Brian grappled with Jack. Their struggle broadcast on every screen across the galaxy. They crashed to the ground, rolling dangerously close to the platform's edge. Suddenly, Janus was there. She had retrieved a ceremonial weapon from the ritual altar, its bioluminescent surface pulsing with energy. With movements too fast for Brian to follow, she disarmed Jack, sending his crude weapon skittering across the platform. Commander Orlov and his team swarmed the stage, subduing Jack and his followers. But the danger wasn't over. The conservative Zarantines, led by the elderly female, had reached the platform. To everyone's surprise, the Zarantine leader raised her arms, her exoskeleton flashing patterns that brought her followers to a halt. "I am Zixala," her translator conveyed. "I came to stop this ritual, but I have witnessed true devotion between species. The human protected his Zarantine mate without hesitation. This union has my blessing." A cheer erupted from the crowd, humans and Zarantines alike united in their approval. Admiral Campbell's hologram flickered urgently. "Continue the ritual," she ordered. "We must show the galaxy that nothing will stop this union." Still breathing heavily from the fight, Brian turned to Janus. Her exoskeleton was scraped from the scuffle, a reminder of the danger they had faced together. "Shall we?" he asked, extending his hand. Janus took it, her touch sending a familiar warmth through him. They moved to the center of the platform, where a specially designed apparatus waited for the exchange of genetic material. As they activated the device, their bodies began to glow. Bioluminescent patterns danced across Janus's exoskeleton, while Brian's skin emitted a soft, pulsing light. The crowd watched in awe as the lights intertwined, creating a dazzling display of interspecies unity. When the ritual concluded, the plaza erupted in cheers. Medical teams rushed to treat the injured, humans and Zarantines working side by side. Governor Steele's voice came over the public address system, announcing the formation of a joint emergency response team. As Brian and Janus were escorted from the platform, now hailed as heroes by both species, Brian caught sight of Admiral Campbell's hologram. Her expression was one of satisfaction, perhaps even a hint of pride. "Well done," she said simply, before her image flickered out. The walk back to their home was a blur of congratulations and well wishes from both species. Security had been heightened, a reminder that not everyone supported their union. As they finally entered their home, Brian and Janus stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling upon them. They were no longer just a couple navigating an interspecies relationship. They had become symbols, their every action now tied to the future of human-Zarantine relations. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but Janus placed a gentle limb on his lips. Her exoskeleton shimmered with a pattern he recognized as both excitement and apprehension. "I know," she said softly, her antennae brushing his cheek. "Everything has changed, but we face it together, yes?" Brian nodded, pulling her close. As they stood there, human and Zarantine entwined, he couldn't help but wonder what challenges tomorrow would bring. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with potential dangers and uncharted diplomatic waters. But in this moment, holding Janus, Brian felt ready to face whatever the universe had in store for them. As the first rays of dawn crept through their window, Brian and Janus stirred from their uneasy sleep. The events of the previous day had left them physically and emotionally drained, yet there was no time to rest. A priority message from Governor Steele's office blinked insistently on their communication panel. "An emergency meeting," Brian groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Can't we have one day of peace?" Janus's antennae twitched in agreement. "It seems our journey has only begun," she replied, her exoskeleton rippling with patterns of concern. They made their way to the Colonial Administration building, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. The streets of New Harmony were abuzz with activity, screens everywhere replaying footage of their bonding ritual. Governor Steele's office was a hive of activity when they arrived. The governor himself looked haggard, his usually impeccable suit wrinkled from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "Brian, Janus," he greeted them, gesturing to a pair of seats, one standard, one adapted for Zarantine physiology. "I'm afraid we have a situation on our hands." As they sat, a familiar hologram flickered to life. Admiral Helena Campbell's stern visage appeared before them, her expression unreadable. "Your bonding ritual has gone viral," the Admiral stated without preamble. "It's being broadcast across human and Zarantine space. The response has been unexpected." Governor Steele pulled up a series of holographic displays, each showing news feeds from various worlds. Brian and Janus watched in stunned silence as reports poured in of human Zarantine couples coming forward, inspired by their public union. "The number of interspecies relationships being revealed is staggering," Steele explained. "It seems you've sparked a movement. A movement that has caught the attention of both our governments," Admiral Campbell added, her tone grave. "There are concerns about the long-term implications. Genetic, cultural, political. The ramifications are far-reaching." Brian felt Janus stiffen beside him. He reached out, instinctively taking her hand in his. "What does this mean for us?" he asked, dreading the answer. Admiral Campbell's hologram seemed to look directly at them. "It means you're no longer just a couple. You're test subjects, diplomats, and potential parents of a new hybrid species all rolled into one." The Admiral's words hung heavily in the air. Brian and Janus exchanged glances, the weight of their new reality settling upon them. "We need you to undergo a series of medical examinations," Governor Steele said, his voice softening, "to assess the viability of human Zarantine offspring." Janice's exoskeleton rippled with a pattern Brian recognized as discomfort. Our bodies, our private biology, it will all be scrutinized? Admiral Campbell nodded. I understand this is a lot to ask, but the future of interspecies relations may well depend on what we learn from you. Brian squeezed Janice's hand. We'll do it, he said, looking at his wife. She nodded in agreement, her antenna brushing against his cheek in a gesture of solidarity. The next few days were a blur of medical procedures and tests. Human and Zarantine scientists worked side by side, probing and analyzing every aspect of Brian and Janice's biology. Blood samples, tissue biopsies, genetic sequencing, no stone was left unturned in the quest to understand their unique bond. It was during one of these examinations that Dr. Lydia Chen, the lead human geneticist, made a startling discovery. Her eyes widened as she studied the holographic display of Janice's cellular structure. This is unprecedented, Dr. Chen muttered, her fingers flying over the controls to enhance the image. Janice, your cellular makeup is showing signs of adaptation to human physiology. The Zarantine scientist, Dr. Zektal, chittered excitedly. Impossible! Zarantine biology has never demonstrated such plasticity. Brian moved closer to Janice, concern etched on his face. Is she all right? Is this dangerous? Dr. Chen shook her head, her expression a mix of awe and scientific curiosity. As far as we can tell, she's perfectly healthy, but this adaptation, it's as if her body is trying to bridge the gap between our species. News of this discovery spread like wildfire through the scientific community. Within hours, a comm request came through from Earth. Governor Steele patched it through to the medical bay, revealing the face of a man Brian didn't recognize. Dr. Xander Voss, the man introduced himself, his piercing eyes gleaming with intensity even through the holographic display. I'm a xenobiologist specializing in interspecies genetics. I'm on my way to New Harmony as we speak. Brian felt a chill run down his spine at the doctor's tone. There was something in Voss's voice, a terrifying excitement that bordered on mania. I have a proposal, Voss continued, his gaze shifting between Brian and Janice. A groundbreaking experiment that could change the course of both our species' evolution. As Voss outlined his plan, the creation of a human Zarantine hybrid embryo, Brian felt the room spin. He looked at Janice, seeing his own mix of fear and fascination reflected in her compound eyes. Their peaceful life on New Harmony seemed a distant memory now. As Brian and Janice listened to Voss's proposal, they realized they stood at the precipice of a new era, one that would reshape the galaxy in ways they could scarcely imagine. Outside the medical bay, the colony buzzed with activity. Protests and counter-protests clashed in the streets, their chants echoing through the corridors. And beyond, in the vast expanse of space, a Zarantine fleet approached, drawn by the news of Janice's unprecedented biological changes. Brian and Janice stood hand in hand, facing a future filled with uncertainty. The decision they would make in the coming days would not only alter their lives, but potentially the course of human and Zarantine history. As they contemplated their choices, the stars outside seemed to pulse with the weight of destiny. Expectation. As Brian and Janice contemplated their future, a priority alert blared through the colony's communication systems. Attention all citizens, Governor Steele's voice rang out, tinged with urgency. A Zarantine fleet has entered New Harmony's orbit. Please remain calm and await further instructions. Brian and Janice exchanged worried glances. The implications of this development were enormous. We need to get to the command center, Brian said, already moving towards the door. They rushed through the streets, now eerily quiet as colonists retreated indoors. The distant shapes of Zarantine ships loomed in the sky, visible even through the colony's atmospheric shielding. At the command center, they found Governor Steele, Commander Orlov, and a holographic projection of Admiral Campbell engaged in a heated discussion. We can't allow them to dictate terms, Orlov was saying as Brian and Janice entered. Admiral Campbell's hologram turned to face them. Ah, good. You're here. The Zarantine Fleet Commander, Zixnor, is demanding access to Janice for examination by their scientist. Janice's exoskeleton rippled with a pattern of alarm. Why? They're citing concerns about the changes in your physiology, Governor Steele explained. It's causing quite a stir among their leadership. Brian stepped forward, his heart made. What are our options? Admiral Campbell's hologram flickered as she spoke. We need to tread carefully. This could easily escalate into a diplomatic incident, or worse. After a tense discussion, a compromise was reached. Brian and Janus would meet with Zixnor and a team of Zarantine scientists on a neutral space station orbiting New Harmony. The journey to the station was tense. As their shuttle docked, Brian squeezed Janus's hand reassuringly. Whatever happens, we're in this together. The meeting room was a stark utilitarian space designed to accommodate both human and Zarantine physiology. Zixnor, an imposing figure even by Zarantine standards, waited for them with a team of scientists. Greetings, Zixnor's translator conveyed. We appreciate your willingness to meet. As the discussion unfolded, the true nature of the Zarantine's concerns became clear. Zixnor's exoskeleton flashed patterns of agitation as he spoke. The changes in Janus's physiology have triggered deep-seated fears among our leadership, he explained. There are concerns about the loss of our species' identity through interbreeding with humans. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. The implications were staggering. Back on New Harmony, events were unfolding that would further complicate the situation. In a secluded laboratory, Dr. Xander Voss worked feverishly, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and mania. It's working, he muttered, staring at a holographic display. The cellular integration is progressing perfectly. Using genetic samples obtained from Brian and Janus during their medical examinations, Voss had successfully created a human Zarantine hybrid embryo. It was an unauthorized experiment, one that would have far-reaching consequences. Governor Steele's face drained of color when he received the report. Shut it down, he ordered Commander Orlov. Arrest Voss immediately. But as Orlov's team moved to apprehend the scientist, they encountered unexpected resistance. A group of Unity supporters, alerted to Voss's work, had gathered to protect what they saw as the future of human-Zarantine relations. In the ensuing chaos, containment units were damaged. Alarms blared as Voss, clutching a data drive, slipped away in the confusion. News of the hybrid embryo's creation spread like wildfire, reaching the orbiting Zarantine fleet. On the space station, Brian and Janus watched in horror as reports flooded in. This changes everything, Janus said, her antennae drooping. Brian nodded grimly. We need to do something. After a hurried discussion with Admiral Campbell and Governor Steele, they made their decision. Despite the risks, they would volunteer for a joint Zarantine human scientific study. As preparations for the study began, extremist factions on both sides saw Brian and Janus as either saviors or traitors. The couple found themselves at the center of a galactic maelstrom. On New Harmony, Governor Steele implemented stricter security measures, a move that bred resentment among the colonists. Meanwhile, Dr. Voss remained at large, his presence a wild card in an already volatile situation. As Brian and Janus prepared to board the research vessel that would be their home for the duration of the study, they received an encrypted message from Zara. Be careful, it read. There are those who would see this study fail at any cost. Trust no one. The warning took a toll on them as they stepped onto the ship. A mixed team of human and Zarantine scientists awaited them, their faces a mix of excitement and apprehension. As the ship's engines hummed to life, Brian and Janus stood at a viewport, watching New Harmony recede. The Zarantine fleet loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. Are we doing the right thing? Janus asked, her exoskeleton shimmering with uncertainty. Brian took her hand, feeling the now familiar texture of her skin against his. I don't know, he admitted, but we have to try. As the ship accelerated away from the station, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into uncharted territory, both scientifically and politically. The future of interspecies relations hung in the balance, and they were at the very center of it all. The ship's intercom crackled to life. All personnel, prepare for deep space insertion. We're about to embark on a journey that could change the course of history. Brian and Janus exchanged a look. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the stars stretched into lines of light around them, They stepped forward into an uncertain future. Uncertain future, the ship's sudden lurch caught them off guard. Alarms blared as a series of explosions rocked the vessel, sending Brian and Janus stumbling against the viewport. "We're under attack," shouted a human scientist as she rushed past them, her lab coat singed at the edges. Brian grabbed Janus's hand, pulling her away from the crackling sparks erupting from a nearby control panel. "We need to get to the escape pods." They raced through the corridors, dodging falling debris and helping injured crew members along the way. The ship's emergency lighting bathed everything in an eerie red glow, casting long shadows as they ran. As they rounded a corner, they nearly collided with a familiar face. "Zara?" Brian exclaimed, shock momentarily overriding his panic. "What are you doing here?" The security officer's expression was grim. "No time to explain. We need to move now." Together they herded the remaining scientists and crew towards the escape pod bay. Smoke filled the air, acrid and thick, making it difficult to breathe. Janus's antennae twitched rapidly, sensing the growing instability of the ship's structure. "We're losing hull integrity," she warned, her translator struggling to keep up with her rapid chittering. They piled into the escape pods, the doors sealing with a hiss of pressurized air. Brian found himself wedged between Janus and Zara, his heart pounding as the pod ejected from the dying research vessel. Through the small viewport, they watched in horror as their ship, once a beacon of interspecies cooperation, disintegrated in a final catastrophic explosion. The shockwave sent their pod, along with the others, tumbling into the vast emptiness of space. As the pod's stabilizers kicked in, Zara finally spoke. "I stowed away," she admitted. "I had intel that there might be an attack. I couldn't let you two face that alone." Before Brian could respond, the pod's navigation system chimed an alert. "Warning, entering uncharted asteroid field. Communication systems compromised." The occupants of the pod watched in tense silence as they drifted deeper into the field of space rocks. Hours passed, each moment filled with the fear of collision, until finally their pod's emergency thrusters engaged, guiding them towards a massive asteroid. "It's habitable," a Zarantine scientist announced, studying the readouts. "Atmosphere thin but breathable. Gravity approximately 0.8 Earth standard." Their pod, along with two others, touched down on the asteroid's rocky surface. As they emerged, Brian took in their surroundings. The landscape was barren and alien, dotted with crystalline formations that glowed faintly in the light of a distant star. "We need to set up a base camp," Brian said, taking charge of the situation. "Let's pool our supplies and see what we have to work with." Over the next few weeks, humans and Zarantines worked side by side, combining their knowledge and skills to survive in this harsh environment. Brian's practical engineering skills complemented the Zarantines' advanced understanding of xenobiology, allowing them to create shelters and locate sources of water and nutrients. Janus proved invaluable, her changing physiology allowing her to process the alien vegetation they discovered, determining what was safe for human consumption. But as days turned to weeks, Brian noticed his wife's condition changing more rapidly. One evening, as they sat together in their makeshift shelter, Janus turned to him, her compound eyes reflecting the glow of their heat source. "Brian," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I think I'm pregnant." The news sent shockwaves through their small community. The human and Zarantine scientists immediately began running tests, their scientific curiosity overriding any cultural shock. As Janus's pregnancy progressed, the stranded group made remarkable discoveries. The Zarantine scientist, Dr. Zekatal, was beside himself with excitement. "The bonding process between you two," he explained to Brian and Janus, "it's unlocked dormant genetic potential in both your species. This child, it could be the key to true human-Zarantine integration." Weeks turned to months, and their small colony on the asteroid grew more established. They had managed to repair part of the emergency beacon, sending out a weak distress signal. Hope for rescue mingled with a growing sense of camaraderie among the survivors. One day, as Brian was helping Zara reinforce their water reclamation system, she turned to him with a serious expression. "Brian, I need to tell you something," she began, My feelings for you, they weren't what I thought they were. Brian listened as Zara explained how her attraction had been born out of admiration for what he and Janus represented, the potential for human-Zarantine cooperation, rather than genuine romantic interest. I see that now, she finished, her eyes conveying sincerity. What you and Janus have, it's something truly special. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the main shelter. They rushed over to find Janus surrounded by the scientists, her exoskeleton rippling with patterns of distress. The baby, she gasped, it's coming! As they prepared for the unprecedented birth, a small ship appeared in the asteroid's thin atmosphere. It landed near their camp, and out stepped a haggard-looking man clutching a data drive and a containment unit. Dr. Voss, Brian breathed, recognizing the scientist from their earlier communications. Voss approached them, his eyes wild but determined. I intercepted your distress signal, he explained quickly. I brought my research, and this. He held up the containment unit, which housed a small, pulsing form, the hybrid embryo he had created back on New Harmony. As Janus's labor intensified, the group realized that Voss's presence and his research might be the key to ensuring the safety of mother and child. Human and Zarantine medical knowledge combined as they worked tirelessly to bring this new life into the universe. Hours passed, filled with tension and wonder. Finally, a new sound filled the air, the cry of a child, unlike any heard before. Brian held his daughter, marveling at her unique features, a perfect blend of human and Zarantine traits. Unity, Janus whispered, reaching out to touch her child's face. Her name is Unity. As if on cue, the distant rumble of approaching ships echoed across the asteroid's surface. The group rushed outside to see a joint human-Zarantine fleet descending from the sky, led by a familiar vessel. Commander Orlov's voice crackled over their comm system. Looks like we've got a lot of catching up to do, he said, a note of awe in his voice as he took in the scene before him. As the rescue ships landed, Brian and Janus exchanged a look of profound understanding. Their journey was nowhere near the end, but they had already come so far. Together with their new daughter, they stepped forward to greet their rescuers and face whatever challenges lay ahead in this new era of human-Zarantine relations.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.